Have you ever noticed how the moment you truly stop looking for something, it suddenly appears everywhere? Your dream job posting shows up in your inbox the day after you decide to take a break from searching. The person you've been hoping to meet walks into your life when you finally let go of the outcome. It's as if the universe operates on some invisible timing system that responds not to your desperate wanting, but to your quiet knowing. Tonight we're going to explore why you might be missing the most profound communications happening all around you, and how a mystic named Neville Goddard discovered the hidden language through which reality speaks to those who know how to listen. Welcome to another journey into the mysteries that surround us. I'm glad you're here, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it finds you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Perhaps you're winding down after a long day, or maybe you're seeking some clarity in a quiet moment. Either way, you found your way to exactly where you need to be. What I want to share with you tonight might change how you see the seemingly random events of your daily life. It's about recognizing a communication system so subtle, so elegantly woven into the fabric of your experience, that most people walk through their entire lives never noticing it exists. Yet once you learn to perceive these signals, you'll wonder how you ever missed them. Our guide for this exploration is Neville Goddard, a man who spent his life decoding what he called the Bridge of Incidents. Born in Barbados in 1905, Neville began his career as a dancer and actor on Broadway, before evolving into one of the 20th century's most profound mystical teachers. But his background in performance wasn't wasted. It taught him something crucial about the relationship between imagination and reality, between the roles we play in our minds and the experiences that unfold in our world. What Neville discovered was that the universe doesn't communicate through grand gestures or mystical phenomena, but through the ordinary magic of synchronicity, through the poetry of perfectly timed encounters, and through what he termed the Bridge of Incidents. This bridge isn't a metaphor, it's a describable, observable process by which consciousness arranges circumstances to match our deepest assumptions about reality. Let me begin with a story that perfectly illustrates what we're exploring tonight. A woman I know had been struggling with her career for years. She was talented, hard-working, but somehow opportunities kept slipping through her fingers. One day, feeling defeated, she made a decision to stop pushing so hard. She would assume she already had the perfect position, even though her bank account suggested otherwise. The very next week, she was laid off from her current job. To her rational mind, this felt like the final blow, confirmation that the universe was working against her. But 3 days later, while standing in line at a coffee shop she'd never visited before, she overheard a conversation about a company looking for someone with her exact skill set. By the end of the month, she had the job of her dreams, working for people who valued her contributions in ways she'd never experienced. Now, you might call this coincidence, you might attribute it to luck or timing, but Neville would point to something more elegant at work. He would say that her shift in assumption, her willingness to embody the feeling of already having what she desired, created what he called a bridge of incidents. The layoff wasn't punishment. The coffee shop encounter wasn't random. These were the invisible threads of causation responding to a change in consciousness. As you listen to this, notice if anything in your own life might fit this pattern. Have you ever experienced a series of events that seemed disconnected but somehow led you exactly where you needed to go? That's the bridge of incidents revealing itself to your awareness. At the heart of Neville's teaching lies what he called the law of assumption. This isn't the popular law of attraction that suggests we draw things to us from outside ourselves. Instead, Neville taught something far more radical. He proposed that what we assume to be true about ourselves and our world inevitably manifests as our lived experience. Think about this for a moment. Right now, you hold countless assumptions about who you are, what's possible for you, how the world works, how people see you. These assumptions feel so natural, so obviously true, that you probably don't even recognize them as assumptions. They feel like facts. But Neville would suggest that these seemingly factual beliefs are actually the invisible architects of your experience. Here's where it gets interesting. Neville taught that an assumption, though false at the moment you adopt it, will harden into fact if you persist in assuming it. This means that the future isn't something that happens to you. It's something you're actively creating through the assumptions you hold about what's possible. But how do you know when an assumption is taking root? How can you tell when consciousness is beginning to reorganize reality to match your inner state? This is where the signs come in. The universe, or more accurately, your own deeper intelligence, begins to communicate through the language of synchronicity. Take a breath here and consider what assumptions you might be carrying about your own life. What do you assume is possible for you? What do you assume is impossible? These quiet beliefs are working behind the scenes, creating the very experiences that seem to confirm their truth. Neville often said that feeling is the secret, but he wasn't talking about emotion in the way most people understand it. He was pointing to something more subtle and more powerful. When he spoke of feeling, he meant the felt sense of reality that comes with truly accepting an assumption as true. Imagine, for instance, that you want to feel more confident in social situations. Most people approach this by trying to think positive thoughts or by pushing themselves into uncomfortable scenarios. But Neville would suggest a different approach entirely. He would say to assume the feeling of already being confident, to inhabit that state of consciousness as if it were already your natural way of being. This isn't about pretending or fake it till you make it. It's about recognizing that confidence, like all states of being, is a choice of consciousness rather than a result of external circumstances. When you truly assume this feeling, when you wear it like a comfortable garment, the world begins to respond differently to you. But here's what's fascinating. As this internal shift occurs, you'll begin to notice signs that confirm the change is taking hold. People might start treating you differently, even before you've consciously altered your behaviour. Opportunities for leadership might present themselves. You might find yourself in conversations where your input is valued in new ways. These aren't coincidences, they're the external world reshaping itself to match your internal assumption. The bridge of incidence is carrying you from who you thought you were to who you've decided to become. One of Neville's most profound teachings was about living in the end. This practice involves inhabiting the consciousness of already having achieved what you desire, rather than hoping or wishing for it to happen in the future. It's a complete reversal of how most people approach their goals. Consider someone who wants to find their ideal romantic partner. The conventional approach might involve dating apps, social events, perhaps some self-improvement to become more attractive. But living in the end would mean assuming the feeling of already being in that loving relationship, of already being the person who is loved in the way they desire to be loved. This doesn't mean sitting passively and waiting for someone to appear. Rather, it means operating from the consciousness of someone who is already experiencing that love. When you truly embody this state, you naturally make different choices, notice different opportunities, and present yourself to the world differently. The signs that this assumption is working are often subtle at first. You might notice couples everywhere, as if the world has suddenly become populated with happy partnerships. You might overhear conversations about love and relationships at precisely the moments when you need encouragement. You might encounter people who tell you stories that seem to mirror your own desires. This isn't your imagination running wild. It's your consciousness, now aligned with your desired outcome, filtering reality to notice the confirmations and opportunities that were always there but previously invisible to you. As you reflect on this concept, what would it feel like to live in the end of something you're currently working toward? What would change about how you move through your days if you already assumed the reality of your fulfilled desire? The bridge of incidents is perhaps Neville's most mysterious and beautiful teaching. It describes the often inexplicable series of events that unfold to bring an assumption into physical reality. These events rarely follow the logical progression that our rational minds might expect. Instead, they unfold through what appears to be synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, and sometimes what can only be described as magic. Let me share another example. A man decided he wanted to move to a specific city across the country, though he had no job prospects there and limited savings. Rather than focusing on the practical obstacles, he assumed the feeling of already living in that place, of already being settled and happy there. Within 2 weeks, his company announced they were opening a new branch and asked if anyone would be interested in relocating. The location? The exact city he had been imagining. But here's the remarkable part. The company had been planning this expansion for months, but the announcement came just days after his internal shift in assumption. Was this coincidence? From Neville's perspective, the timing reveals something profound about the relationship between consciousness and circumstance. The bridge of incidents doesn't create events out of nothing. Rather, it orchestrates the timing of events that were already in motion, aligning them perfectly with our assumptions about what's possible. This is why the signs often appear as a series of meaningful coincidences rather than obvious miracles. The universe speaks in the language of synchronicity because synchronicity is how consciousness expresses itself in time and space. As we settle deeper into this exploration, let me ask you to pause for a moment and consider the last time you noticed the same number appearing repeatedly in your day. Perhaps it was 11:11 on your clock, or maybe you kept seeing 333 on receipts, license plates, and random street addresses. Most people dismiss these occurrences as mere coincidence, but Neville understood something profound about the relationship between consciousness and pattern recognition. When your assumption begins to take hold in the deeper layers of your mind, your awareness becomes attuned to frequencies that were always present but previously unnoticed. Numbers in particular seem to serve as a kind of cosmic Morse code, appearing with such precise timing that even the most skeptical minds begin to wonder if something more intentional might be at work. Let me share what happened to a friend who had been struggling with a major life decision for months. She was torn between staying in her secure but unfulfilling job and taking a leap into entrepreneurship. After weeks of internal debate, she finally made the assumption that she was already a successful business owner, not someday, but right now in consciousness. She began to inhabit that feeling during quiet moments throughout her day. Within 48 hours, the number sequence 444 began appearing everywhere. Her coffee order total, the time she happened to glance at her phone, the page number where she randomly opened a book. But here's what made it remarkable. Each appearance of 444 coincided with moments when she felt doubt creeping in about her decision. The numbers seemed to arrive precisely when she needed reassurance that she was moving in the right direction. Now, you might wonder how this works from a practical standpoint. The mechanism isn't supernatural, but it is profound. When you shift into a new assumption about yourself, your subconscious mind begins filtering reality differently. The numbers were always there, scattered throughout the environment as they always are. But your consciousness, now aligned with a new frequency of possibility, suddenly develops the capacity to notice them at exactly the moments when you need confirmation. This selective awareness isn't random, it's evidence of something Neville called the responsiveness of consciousness. The deeper intelligence that orchestrates your life experiences uses whatever means available to communicate with your conscious mind. Numbers work particularly well because they're precise, undeniable, and appear in contexts that feel meaningful rather than forced. Take a gentle breath here and reflect on whether you've noticed any repeating patterns in your own life lately. What numbers seem to catch your attention? What might your consciousness be trying to communicate to you through these subtle signals? There's another category of signs that often leaves people wondering if they're losing their minds or experiencing something genuinely mystical. It's the phenomenon of suddenly seeing your specific desire reflected everywhere in your environment. Someone hoping to travel to Italy starts noticing Italian restaurants, Italian language classes, and conversations about Rome everywhere they go. A person wanting to write a novel begins encountering authors, bookshops, and writing workshops with uncanny frequency. This isn't your imagination playing tricks on you. It's what Neville would describe as consciousness tuning into the frequency of your assumption. When you genuinely accept something as already true about your future, your perceptual filters adjust to highlight everything in your environment that relates to that assumption. I remember reading about a woman who'd been dreaming of owning a vintage blue convertible for years. She had a specific model in mind, but it seemed impractical and financially out of reach. One evening, instead of longing for this car, she shifted into the feeling of already owning it. She imagined the sensation of driving it, the wind in her hair, the satisfaction of turning the key in the ignition. The very next day, she saw 3 blue convertibles during her morning commute. This might seem unremarkable, except that she had been driving the same route for 2 years and had never particularly noticed vintage cars before. Over the following weeks, she encountered them in parking lots, at coffee shops, even in movies and advertisements. It was as if the universe had suddenly become populated with exactly the thing she desired. But here's the beautiful part of the story. One of those cars she noticed belonged to an elderly gentleman who happened to be looking for someone to care for it properly. Through a series of conversations that began with her complimenting his vehicle, she ended up purchasing it for far less than she had imagined possible. The bridge of incidents had created not just awareness, but opportunity. This principle works because consciousness is fundamentally creative. When you assume something is true, you don't just change your internal state, you change your relationship to the entire field of possibilities around you. What was previously invisible becomes obvious. What seemed impossible begins to feel inevitable. As you consider this, what have you been assuming is beyond your reach? What desire have you been treating as someday rather than now? Notice how even thinking about it might shift your awareness of what's already present in your environment. Here we encounter one of the most counterintuitive aspects of how consciousness communicates through experience. Sometimes the clearest sign that your assumption is working is the appearance of what seems like obstacles or setbacks. This confuses many people, leading them to abandon their assumptions precisely when those assumptions are beginning to take hold in reality. Neville taught that the bridge of incidents doesn't always unfold in ways that please the rational mind. Sometimes the path to fulfillment requires the dissolution of existing structures that are incompatible with your new assumption about yourself. A relationship that felt secure but limited might end. A job that provided stability but no growth might become intolerable. These apparent losses create space for something more aligned with who you're becoming. Consider the story of a man who had been assuming the feeling of being recognized for his creative work. For months, nothing seemed to change. Then suddenly, his current employer restructured his department, eliminating his position. To his logical mind, this felt like evidence that his assumption wasn't working. He was further from recognition than ever. But within weeks of this apparent setback, he was contacted by a former colleague who had started a creative agency. She'd been thinking about him for months, wondering if he might be interested in joining their team. The position offered not only better compensation, but also the creative recognition he had been assuming was already his. The job loss, which initially felt like punishment, had actually been the bridge incident that freed him to receive what he had been claiming in consciousness. This pattern repeats endlessly in the lives of those who understand how assumption works. What appears to be moving you away from your desire is often moving you toward it by removing the limitations that were preventing its fulfillment. The key is to maintain your assumption even when external circumstances seem to contradict it. The universe, speaking through the intelligence of your own consciousness, sometimes knows better than your logical mind what needs to shift for your assumption to become fact. Trust becomes essential during these apparent detours. The bridge of incidents is still operating, even when you can't see where it's leading. Pause for a moment and consider whether there might be any apparent obstacles in your life that could actually be redirections towards something better, aligned with who you're becoming. As your assumptions begin to work their way from the surface of your mind into the deeper layers where transformation occurs, you might notice your emotional responses becoming more intense than usual. This heightened sensitivity often catches people off guard, leading them to wonder if they're doing something wrong or if the process is somehow backfiring. Neville understood this emotional amplification as a natural part of consciousness, reorganizing itself around a new assumption. When you decide to embody a different version of yourself, you're essentially asking your entire system to update its programming. This process can surface emotions that have been dormant, fears that have been hidden, and excitements that have been suppressed. A woman I know began assuming the feeling of being deeply loved and appreciated by a romantic partner. She had been single for several years and had grown comfortable with her independence. But as this assumption took root, she found herself crying unexpectedly while watching romantic movies, feeling waves of longing that seemed to come from nowhere, and experiencing moments of pure joy that felt almost overwhelming. These emotional fluctuations weren't signs that her assumption was failing. They were evidence that it was working. Her consciousness was adjusting to accommodate a reality that included the love she had been claiming. The tears were releasing old beliefs about her worthiness. The joy was her system recognizing the truth of what she was assuming. Within months, she met someone who treated her exactly as she'd been imagining, as if her assumption had magnetized the experience into being. This emotional intensity serves another purpose. It keeps your assumption alive and active in your consciousness. When you feel deeply about something, you naturally think about it more often, imagine it more vividly, and embody its reality more completely. The emotions aren't just byproducts of the process. They're part of the mechanism through which assumptions become facts. If you're experiencing unusual emotional responses to ideas or situations related to what you're assuming, consider this a positive sign. Your consciousness is recalibrating itself to match your new assumption about what's possible. Let these feelings flow without judgment. They're part of the bridge, carrying you from where you were to where you're going. One of the most elegant aspects of how consciousness communicates is through the phenomenon of perfect timing. Events, meetings, and opportunities seem to appear at exactly the moment when you're ready to receive them, often after periods when nothing seemed to be happening at all. This divine orchestration operates according to principles that the rational mind struggles to understand. From the perspective of assumption and consciousness, timing isn't random or externally imposed. It emerges from the interaction between your internal readiness and the field of possibilities that surrounds you. I once heard about a musician who'd been assuming the feeling of performing his original songs for appreciative audiences. For months, he practiced this assumption during meditation, imagining the applause, the connection with listeners, the satisfaction of sharing his creative work. But externally, nothing seemed to change. He continued playing small venues to mostly indifferent crowds. Then, on a particularly difficult evening when he was questioning whether his assumption meant anything at all, a music producer happened to be in the audience. She had been looking for exactly the style of music he was creating, but their paths had never crossed despite being in the same city for years. That night, something prompted her to visit a venue she had never been to before, at exactly the time when he was performing. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was conscious. His assumption had created a field of possibility that drew the right person to the right place at the right moment. But the timing depended on both his internal readiness and her external availability. The bridge of incidents had been operating invisibly, arranging circumstances that would allow their paths to intersect when it would be most meaningful. This is why patience becomes a spiritual practice when you're working with assumption. You're not waiting passively for something to happen to you. You're allowing consciousness to arrange the perfect conditions for your assumption to manifest in the most beneficial way possible. As you reflect on your own life, notice how often things have worked out with timing that seemed almost impossibly perfect. These weren't accidents. They were consciousness expressing itself through the beautiful choreography of synchronicity. Perhaps nowhere do the signs of changing assumptions appear more clearly than in your relationships with other people. As you shift into new assumptions about yourself, the people around you begin to respond differently, often before you've consciously altered your behaviour in any obvious way. This happens because consciousness is inherently relational. Who you assume yourself to be in any moment affects the field of interaction between you and everyone you encounter. When you change your assumption about your worth, your capabilities, or your lovability, others sense this shift and respond accordingly. A teacher I know had been struggling with classroom management for years. Students seemed to disrespect her authority, and she found herself constantly fighting for control. Then she began assuming the feeling of being naturally respected and appreciated by her students. She didn't change her teaching methods or implement new disciplinary policies. She simply began to embody the consciousness of someone who was valued and respected. Within days, she noticed subtle shifts. Students who had been disruptive began participating more constructively. The overall energy of her classroom felt more collaborative and less combative. By the end of the month, other teachers were asking what she'd done differently, but she hadn't done anything externally. She had simply changed her assumption about how students related to her. This principle extends to all relationships. When you assume the feeling of being loved, people tend to be more loving toward you. When you assume the feeling of being successful, others begin to see and treat you as successful. When you assume the feeling of being wise, people start seeking your advice and valuing your opinions. The mechanism isn't mysterious when you understand that consciousness is the foundation of all interaction. People respond not just to your words and actions, but to the field of being that emanates from your assumptions about yourself. Change the assumption, and you change the field. Change the field, and you change how others experience and respond to you. Take a moment to consider how people have been treating you lately. Have you noticed any shifts in their behaviour that might reflect changes in your own assumptions about yourself? These interpersonal signs often provide the clearest feedback about which of your assumptions are taking root in reality. This exploration of how consciousness shapes our experience through signs and synchronicities reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself. The boundaries between inner and outer, between self and world, prove to be far more fluid than we typically imagine. As we continue to investigate these mysteries, we find ourselves approaching questions that touch the very foundations of existence. In our previous exploration of how consciousness might transcend the boundaries we normally assume it has, we examined whether awareness itself might be more fundamental than we realize. Tonight's journey into the signs that consciousness sends us builds upon that foundation, suggesting that we live in a universe far more responsive and interconnected than conventional wisdom would suggest. Now, as we prepare to delve even deeper into these mysteries, we approach questions that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between mind and reality, between consciousness and the physical world. As evening settles around you and consciousness begins its nightly journey toward rest, something remarkable happens to your ability to receive the universe's communications. The rational mind, with all its filters and limitations, gradually steps aside, creating space for a more direct dialogue between your assumptions and the field of infinite possibility. Dreams have long been recognized as a bridge between the conscious and unconscious realms, but from Neville's perspective, they serve an even more specific function. They become a testing ground where your assumptions can play out without the constraints of physical reality, offering you glimpses of what consciousness is preparing to manifest in your waking experience. Consider the experience of a woman who had been assuming the feeling of living in her ideal home. For weeks, this assumption felt abstract during her waking hours, competing with the obvious reality of her cramped apartment and limited budget. But then the dreams began. Night after night, she found herself walking through spacious rooms filled with natural light, tending a garden she had only imagined, hosting gatherings in a kitchen that felt both foreign and familiar. These weren't wishes or fantasies. They carried the weight of memory, as if she were recalling places she had actually lived. Upon waking, she would feel a profound sense of rightness about these dream spaces, a feeling that lingered throughout her day and subtly influenced her actions and choices. Within 3 months, a distant relative she barely knew contacted her family about a house that needed caretaking. The property matched her dreams with startling precision, down to details she had never consciously considered but had experienced clearly in sleep. The dreams hadn't been random neural firing. They had been consciousness rehearsing a reality that was already taking shape in the invisible realm of possibility. This phenomenon occurs because during sleep, your conscious resistance to new possibilities diminishes significantly. The part of your mind that insists things must remain as they are becomes quiet, allowing your deeper intelligence to explore and integrate the implications of your assumptions without interference. Pay attention to the dreams that feel particularly vivid or emotionally significant. Notice when dream content begins to mirror the assumptions you've been working with in your waking life. These nocturnal experiences often provide the first concrete glimpse of how your assumptions are translating into potential realities. Here we encounter one of the most delicate aspects of working with assumption and recognizing the signs of its operation. The very act of watching for signs can sometimes interfere with the natural unfolding of the bridge of incidents. It's as if consciousness requires a certain lightness of touch, a willingness to trust the process without gripping too tightly to specific outcomes. Neville spoke often about the importance of what he called the Sabbath, a period of rest after you've planted the seed of your assumption. This isn't passive waiting, but rather an active state of confidence in the reality of what you've assumed. It's the difference between a gardener who plants a seed and then constantly digs it up to check for growth, and one who plants with care and then trusts the natural processes to unfold. I'm reminded of a story about a man who desperately wanted to reconcile with his estranged brother. He began assuming the feeling of their relationship being healed, imagining conversations filled with understanding and mutual respect. For weeks, he monitored every phone call, every piece of mail, every social media update for signs that his assumption was working. The more he watched, the more frustrated he became. His hypervigilance actually began to undermine his ability to maintain the feeling of reconciliation. He was operating from the consciousness of someone waiting for something to happen, rather than someone for whom it had already happened. Finally, exhausted by his own monitoring, he simply stopped looking for signs. He maintained his assumption during his quiet moments, but released the need to track its progress. Within days of this shift, his brother called unexpectedly. The conversation that followed was exactly what he had been imagining: natural, healing, and filled with the understanding he had been assuming was already present between them. This teaches us something profound about the relationship between consciousness and manifestation. The universe responds most readily to assumptions that are held with confident lightness rather than desperate intensity. When you truly know something is already yours in consciousness, you don't need to monitor its arrival. You can trust the bridge of incidents to unfold in perfect timing. As you work with your own assumptions, notice the difference between confident knowing and anxious hoping. The signs flow most freely when you're operating from the former rather than the latter. One of the most subtle yet powerful categories of signs involves changes in your immediate environment that seem to occur without your direct intervention. As your assumptions shift, you may notice that your living space, your workspace, even your daily routes begin to transform in ways that support your new sense of self. This isn't about consciously redecorating or making dramatic changes. Rather, it's about how consciousness naturally seeks expression through the spaces and objects that surround you. When you assume a new version of yourself, that version has different preferences, different needs, different ways of organizing and inhabiting space. A friend who had been assuming the feeling of being a successful writer noticed that her cluttered desk gradually began to organize itself. Not through any conscious effort on her part, but through small, seemingly automatic choices. She would find herself clearing away distractions, arranging her notebooks differently, creating a space that felt more conducive to creative work. Books about writing began appearing in her life. Gifts from friends, recommendations from acquaintances, volumes she discovered at library sales. Her environment was reshaping itself to match her assumption about who she was becoming. The external world was conforming to the internal reality she had been cultivating. Within months, she was writing regularly and had completed the first draft of a novel she had been contemplating for years. This environmental mirroring occurs because consciousness and circumstance are more intimately connected than we typically realize. When you change your assumptions about yourself, you naturally gravitate toward conditions that support those assumptions. You make different choices about where to spend time, what objects to keep around you, how to arrange your space. But it goes deeper than personal preference. There seems to be an intelligence at work that orchestrates environmental changes in ways that support your evolving assumptions. Opportunities to acquire objects that match your new self-concept appear. Spaces become available that feel aligned with who you're becoming. People offer resources that support your assumed reality. Take a gentle look around your current environment. Have you noticed any spontaneous changes that might reflect shifts in your own assumptions about yourself? Sometimes, the most profound transformations begin with the smallest environmental adjustments. There's a particular type of sign that seems to operate through what we might call the soundtrack of your life. The songs, conversations, and ambient sounds that provide the auditory backdrop to your daily experience. When assumptions are actively working their way into manifestation, you may notice that the universe begins to speak to you through precisely the words and melodies you need to hear. This auditory synchronicity often catches people off guard because it feels so personal and immediate. You're thinking about a particular challenge, and suddenly a song on the radio offers exactly the perspective you needed. You're questioning whether your assumption is working, and you overhear a conversation that provides reassurance. You're wondering about next steps, and a podcast randomly delivers the guidance you've been seeking. Let me share the experience of a woman who had been assuming the feeling of being worthy of deep, authentic love. She had spent years in relationships that felt superficial or one-sided, and she was working to embody the consciousness of someone who naturally attracted and maintained meaningful connections. One morning, feeling particularly doubtful about whether this assumption could ever become reality, she turned on her car radio. The first song that played contained lyrics about recognizing your own worth and not settling for less than you deserve. Coincidence, perhaps, but then it happened again the next day, and the day after that. Different songs, different stations, but consistently relevant messages about self-worth and authentic love. More remarkably, she began noticing that conversations around her seemed to touch on these themes with unusual frequency. Strangers in coffee shops would be discussing healthy relationship dynamics. Colleagues would share stories about finding love later in life. Even television shows seemed to feature storylines about people learning to value themselves. This auditory environment was reflecting and reinforcing her assumption, creating a field of supportive messaging that helped her maintain the feeling she was cultivating. Within 6 months, she met someone whose approach to relationship perfectly matched what she had been assuming was possible for her. The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves the same principle we've explored with other signs: consciousness filtering reality to notice confirmations of your assumptions. But auditory signs often feel more immediate and personal because sound has a direct emotional impact that bypasses the analytical mind. As you move through your days, begin to notice the auditory landscape around you. What words, lyrics, or conversations seem to appear when you need them most? The universe may be speaking to you more directly than you realize. As we delve deeper into understanding how consciousness communicates through signs, we encounter the fascinating realm of intuitive knowing, those subtle inner promptings that seem to arise from nowhere, but often guide us toward exactly what we need. From Neville's perspective, these intuitive nudges aren't random impulses, but rather communications from the deeper intelligence that orchestrates the bridge of incidents. Intuition operates below the threshold of conscious thought, processing vast amounts of information and presenting conclusions in the form of feelings, hunches, or sudden knowing. When your assumptions begin to take root in consciousness, your intuitive faculties become more attuned to opportunities and connections that support those assumptions. Consider the experience of a man who had been assuming the feeling of being financially abundant. He had struggled with money for years, but rather than focusing on his current limitations, he began to embody the consciousness of someone for whom money flowed easily and naturally. One afternoon, while walking through his neighbourhood, he felt a sudden urge to take a different route home, a path he rarely used. He couldn't explain the impulse, but it felt important to follow it. Along this unfamiliar street, he noticed a small business with a help wanted sign that seemed to call out to him. On impulse, he went inside to inquire. The position turned out to be perfect for his skills, offered better compensation than his current job, and provided opportunities for advancement he had never imagined possible. The timing was crucial. They had just decided to post the position that morning, and he was among the first to apply. This sequence illustrates how intuitive guidance often operates as part of the bridge of incidents. The urge to take a different route wasn't random. It was his deeper intelligence, aligned with his assumption about financial abundance, guiding him toward an opportunity that would support that assumption's manifestation. Intuitive promptings often feel subtle and gentle rather than dramatic or overwhelming. They might appear as a sudden interest in visiting a particular place, an urge to contact someone you haven't spoken to in months, or a feeling that you should attend an event you might normally skip. The key is learning to distinguish between intuitive guidance and mental chatter. Genuine intuitive promptings usually feel calm and clear, even when they suggest actions that don't make logical sense. They carry a quality of rightness that transcends rational analysis. As you work with your assumptions, begin to notice these subtle inner promptings. What actions feel inexplicably right, even when you can't explain why? Following these gentle nudges often leads to the very experiences and connections that support your evolving sense of self. Throughout this exploration, we've been discussing signs as external confirmations of internal shifts in consciousness. But there's another category of signs that's equally important: the changes you notice within yourself as your assumptions take root and begin to transform your inner landscape. These internal signs often appear as shifts in your emotional baseline, changes in what captures your attention, or alterations in how you respond to situations that would have previously triggered specific reactions. They represent consciousness updating its own operating system to match your new assumptions about what's possible and true. A woman I know had spent years assuming she was fundamentally anxious and prone to worry. This assumption had become so integrated into her identity that she couldn't imagine herself any other way. But then she began experimenting with assuming the feeling of being naturally calm and centered, even in challenging situations. The first internal sign she noticed was subtle. Situations that would normally trigger immediate anxiety instead prompted a moment of pause. She would find herself taking a breath before reacting, accessing a space of calm she didn't remember having before. Her sleep began to improve without any changes to her routine or environment. She noticed herself choosing different activities during her free time, gravitating toward experiences that supported the peaceful state she was cultivating. These internal shifts preceded any external changes in her life, but they were equally real and significant. Her consciousness was reorganizing itself around a new assumption, and she could feel this transformation happening from the inside out. Internal signs also include changes in your relationship to time, your sense of personal agency, and your general outlook on possibilities. When assumptions are working, you might notice increased confidence in areas where you previously felt uncertain, or a natural tendency toward actions that support your desired outcomes. Perhaps most importantly, you may notice a growing sense of inevitability about your desired outcomes. Not desperate hope, but calm certainty. This feeling of knowing that something is already true in consciousness and therefore must eventually appear in experience represents one of the most reliable internal signs that your assumptions are taking root. Take a moment to reflect on any internal changes you've noticed in yourself recently. How has your emotional baseline shifted? What captures your attention differently than it used to? These internal signs often provide the first evidence that consciousness is beginning to reorganize around new possibilities. I recall the story of a man who had been assuming the feeling of being valued and respected in his professional life. For months after beginning this practice, his work situation seemed to deteriorate. Colleagues became more difficult, his supervisor seemed increasingly critical, and projects he had once enjoyed felt burdensome and frustrating. Rather than abandoning his assumption, he recognized these challenges as signs that his consciousness was outgrowing his current professional environment. The discomfort wasn't random, it was pointing toward the need for change. Within 6 months, he had transitioned to a new position where his contributions were genuinely appreciated and his skills were utilized more effectively. The resistance he experienced wasn't opposition to his assumption. It was consciousness creating the necessary motivation to move toward experiences that matched his new sense of self-worth. This principle applies to many areas of life. When you assume a new level of self-love, relationships that don't support this assumption may become strained. When you assume greater creative expression, activities that stifle creativity may feel increasingly intolerable. When you assume financial abundance, situations that reinforce scarcity consciousness may become unbearable. The key is to recognize these forms of resistance as signs of progress rather than failure. They indicate that your assumption is working so effectively that your current circumstances can no longer contain your expanded sense of what's possible. If you're experiencing unusual friction or resistance in any area of your life, consider whether it might be consciousness clearing space for something more aligned with your deepest assumptions about yourself. This recognition of resistance as a form of communication brings us full circle to the fundamental principle we've been exploring, that consciousness is constantly communicating with us through the language of experience. Every event, every encounter, every apparent coincidence carries information about the assumptions we're holding and how those assumptions are translating into lived reality. The universe isn't speaking to you through grand gestures or mystical phenomena. It's communicating through the ordinary magic of your daily experience, through the subtle patterns of synchronicity that weave through your life like golden threads. Learning to recognize this constant dialogue transforms everything. You're never alone, never without guidance, never truly lost. You're always in conversation with the infinite intelligence that expresses itself through the beautiful complexity of your human experience. As we continue this gentle exploration into the hidden communications that surround us, let's turn our attention to something that bridges the mystical insights we've been discussing with the emerging frontiers of modern science. There's a growing body of research suggesting that consciousness itself might operate according to principles far more interconnected than we've traditionally understood. Take a moment to consider this. When you walk into a room where an argument has just taken place, you can often sense the tension even if no one tells you what happened. When you're around someone who's genuinely peaceful, you might find yourself naturally becoming calmer. These everyday experiences hint at something profound about how consciousness might influence and be influenced by the field of awareness around us. Recent studies in what researchers call field consciousness have produced results that challenge our conventional understanding of how individual minds relate to collective experience. While these findings remain preliminary and require much more research to be definitively established, they suggest that consciousness might operate more like a field phenomenon than an isolated individual experience. One of the most intriguing areas of investigation involves what happens when groups of people focus their attention on similar outcomes. Some studies have found correlations between periods of collective focus and measurable changes in environmental systems, though the mechanisms behind these correlations remain largely mysterious, and the findings are still being debated within the scientific community. This research doesn't prove that consciousness directly manipulates physical reality in the way some popular interpretations suggest. Rather, it hints at something more subtle and elegant. It suggests that consciousness might be fundamentally relational, operating through networks of connection and influence that we're only beginning to understand. From this perspective, the signs and synchronicities we've been exploring tonight might represent not just individual experiences, but participation in larger patterns of consciousness that extend beyond the boundaries of any single mind. Your assumptions and the external confirmations you receive might be part of a vast, interconnected web of awareness that includes but transcends your personal experience. As you reflect on this possibility, notice how it might change your relationship to the signs you encounter. They're not just messages to you, but expressions of your participation in something much larger and more magnificent than any individual consciousness could contain. There's a particular rhythm to how consciousness communicates through signs, a cadence that becomes apparent once you begin to pay attention. It's not constant or overwhelming, but rather comes in waves, like a gentle tide that brings messages when you're ready to receive them and recedes when you need space to integrate what you've received. Understanding this rhythm can help you develop what might be called receptive awareness, a state of openness to communication without the anxious scanning for confirmation that can actually interfere with the natural flow of signs. It's the difference between desperately searching for proof and calmly remaining available to guidance. I'm reminded of a musician who described learning to receive creative inspiration. Early in her career, she would sit at her piano, forcing melodies, pushing for breakthrough moments, becoming frustrated when nothing came. But gradually, she learned to create space for inspiration rather than demanding it. She would sit quietly, hands resting on the keys, not trying to compose but simply remaining open to whatever wanted to emerge. The music that came through this receptive approach was invariably more beautiful and authentic than anything she could force into existence. She had learned to work with the natural rhythm of creative consciousness rather than against it. This same principle applies to receiving signs from the universe. When you're desperately seeking confirmation, your anxiety can actually create static in the very channels through which communication flows. But when you maintain your assumptions, with confident patience, signs tend to appear with elegant timing and unmistakable clarity. The rhythm of receiving also involves learning to distinguish between genuine signs and the mind's tendency to find patterns where none exist. True signs carry a quality of resonance that goes beyond intellectual recognition. They feel meaningful at a level that transcends analysis, creating a sense of rightness that your entire being recognizes. This discernment develops over time, like learning to distinguish between different qualities of silence or recognizing the subtle variations in a familiar friend's voice. The more you work with assumptions and remain open to their confirmation, the more refined your ability becomes to recognize authentic communication from consciousness. Take a breath here and consider your own relationship to receiving. Are you approaching signs with desperate seeking or calm availability? The quality of your receptiveness often determines the clarity of what you receive. As we explore deeper into how consciousness orchestrates the manifestation of our assumptions, we encounter something that might be called the geometry of transformation. Just as a river follows the path of least resistance while carving its channel through the landscape, the bridge of incidents tends to unfold through natural lines of connection and possibility that already exist in the fabric of your life. This principle helps explain why manifestations often appear to happen through coincidence rather than obvious miracles. Consciousness works with the materials at hand, weaving together existing relationships, circumstances, and opportunities in new configurations that serve your evolving assumptions about reality. Consider the story of a woman who had been assuming the feeling of living in a community where she felt truly understood and appreciated. She had lived in the same city for years but felt isolated, as if she was speaking a language no one else understood. Rather than moving to a new place which seemed financially impossible, she began to embody the consciousness of already belonging to her ideal community. Within weeks, she started noticing activities and groups in her existing city that she had somehow overlooked before. A book club that met just blocks from her apartment. A volunteering opportunity that aligned perfectly with her values. A neighbour who shared her interest in sustainable living and had been hoping to find someone to collaborate with on local projects. The community she'd been seeking wasn't waiting for her in some distant location. It was already present in her environment, but her previous assumptions about isolation had filtered it out of her awareness. When she shifted her assumption, the geometry of her existing life reorganized to reveal connections that had been there all along. This geometric principle suggests that consciousness doesn't typically create something from nothing, but rather reveals what was already present in potential form. The bridge of incidents connects existing dots in new patterns, illuminating possibilities that were always there but previously invisible. Understanding this can help you recognize signs more readily. Instead of looking for dramatic external changes, begin noticing how existing elements in your life might be rearranging themselves to support your assumptions. The transformation often happens through subtle shifts in the patterns that were already present. What you pay attention to grows stronger in your experience. This isn't merely a philosophical observation, but a practical principle that governs how consciousness shapes reality through the mysterious alchemy of focused awareness. When you direct your attention consistently toward evidence of your assumptions manifesting, you strengthen the neural pathways that recognize and attract such evidence. This process works through what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. When you regularly notice signs and synchronicities, you're literally rewiring your brain to become more sensitive to such patterns. What begins as conscious practice gradually becomes automatic recognition. But there's something even more subtle at work here. Attention itself seems to influence the field of possibilities around you. When you consistently focus on evidence that your assumptions are manifesting, you're not just becoming better at noticing such evidence, you appear to be participating in its creation. I once knew a photographer who became fascinated by the way light fell across urban landscapes at different times of day. The more attention he paid to these subtle variations in illumination, the more remarkable lighting conditions he seemed to encounter. It was as if his focused attention was drawing him toward moments when the city revealed its most beautiful aspects. He began to suspect that attention itself was somehow magnetic, attracting the very phenomena it focused upon. While this remains a speculative idea rather than a proven scientific fact, his experience illustrates something many people discover when working with consciousness: an assumption that focused attention seems to increase the frequency of experiences that match that focus. This principle has practical implications for recognizing signs. When you begin paying attention to synchronicities, you tend to encounter more of them. When you focus on evidence of your assumptions manifesting, such evidence appears more frequently. The attention itself becomes part of the creative process. However, this must be balanced with the lightness of touch we discussed earlier. There's a difference between focused attention and obsessive monitoring. The former enhances receptivity, while the latter creates resistance. The key is learning to pay attention without attachment, to focus without forcing. As you continue working with your assumptions, experiment with this principle of attentional alchemy. Notice what happens when you gently direct your focus toward evidence of your desired reality. But remember to hold this focus lightly, with the confidence of someone who knows that what they seek is already seeking them. Just as the natural world moves through cycles of planting, growth, harvest, and rest, consciousness seems to follow similar rhythms in manifesting assumptions into lived reality. Understanding these natural seasons of manifestation can help you recognize where you are in the process and what kinds of signs to expect at different stages. The planting season occurs when you first adopt a new assumption about yourself or your possibilities. During this phase, signs tend to be subtle and internal. You might notice slight shifts in your emotional baseline, changes in what captures your attention, or gentle alterations in your daily preferences. These are the tender shoots of transformation beginning to emerge from the soil of consciousness. A man I know began assuming the feeling of being recognized as a leader in his field. During the early weeks of this practice, the signs were almost invisible to external observation. He found himself standing a little straighter, speaking with slightly more authority, choosing to attend professional events he might have previously avoided. These weren't dramatic changes, but they represented consciousness beginning to embody a new assumption about what was possible. The growth season follows, marked by increasing frequency and clarity of external signs. Synchronicities become more noticeable, opportunities begin to appear, and other people start responding to you differently. This is when the bridge of incidents becomes most active, arranging circumstances and connections that support your evolving assumption about yourself. During this phase, our aspiring leader began receiving invitations to participate in industry panels. Colleagues started seeking his advice more frequently, and he found himself naturally taking on more visible roles in professional settings. The external world was beginning to mirror the internal shift that had been occurring. The harvest season represents the full manifestation of your assumption into tangible reality. The signs during this phase often involve the actual experience of what you had been assuming. It's not just that opportunities for leadership appear, but that you find yourself naturally and comfortably occupying leadership roles. Finally, there's a rest season, during which the new reality integrates and stabilizes. The dramatic signs tend to decrease because your assumption has become fact. You no longer need constant confirmation because you're living the reality you once only imagined. Understanding these seasons helps you maintain faith during the quieter periods and recognize progress during the more active phases. Each season has its own gifts and challenges, its own types of signs and communications from consciousness. Take a moment to consider which season you might be experiencing with any assumptions you're currently working with. This recognition can help you align your expectations with the natural rhythm of manifestation. As our exploration draws toward its close, we arrive at perhaps the most profound aspect of how consciousness communicates through signs. The way in which the universe seems to mirror back to us, not just our assumptions, but our deepest questions about meaning and purpose. The signs we receive are rarely generic or impersonal. Instead, they tend to speak to us in our own symbolic language, using imagery, metaphors, and connections that resonate with our particular way of making meaning from experience. It's as if consciousness knows each person's unique interpretive framework and communicates through that personal lens. A woman who had been a professional dancer before retiring due to injury found that her signs often came through movement and rhythm. When she began assuming the feeling of finding new purpose beyond dance, she started noticing the way people walked, the rhythm of construction, work outside her apartment, the dance-like quality of everyday activities she had never perceived before. These weren't random observations, but communications in her native symbolic language. Consciousness was speaking to her through the medium she understood most deeply, helping her recognize that her connection to movement and flow could find expression in forms she hadn't yet imagined. This personalization of signs suggests something remarkable about the nature of consciousness itself. It implies that the intelligence communicating through synchronicity and meaningful coincidence understands not just what we need, but how we individually make sense of our experience. The mirror of meaning also operates through what we might call symbolic echoes, repeated themes or images that appear across different contexts in your life, creating a sense of coherent communication over time. You might notice that certain animals, colours, numbers, or symbols keep appearing in various forms, each instance adding another layer to an ongoing conversation between your conscious mind and the deeper intelligence orchestrating your experience. These symbolic patterns often intensify around periods of transition or growth, as if consciousness is offering additional guidance when you most need to understand which direction to move. The symbols themselves usually relate to your personal history, cultural background, or individual associations, making the communication feel intimate and specifically intended for you. As you become more aware of your own symbolic language, you'll begin to recognize the personalized nature of how consciousness speaks to you. What metaphors resonate most deeply with your way of understanding? What symbols have carried special meaning throughout your life? These elements often become the vocabulary through which the universe communicates its guidance. Tonight, we've journeyed through the subtle landscape of how consciousness communicates with those who learn to listen. We've explored the bridge of incidents that carries assumptions from imagination into reality, the various forms that signs and synchronicities take, and the deeply personal nature of how the universe speaks to each individual consciousness. But perhaps the most important recognition is this: the conversation never ends. Every moment offers an opportunity for communication between your conscious mind and the vast intelligence that orchestrates the dance of experience. The signs we've discussed tonight aren't occasional gifts, but expressions of an ongoing dialogue that surrounds you always. This dialogue operates whether you're aware of it or not, but conscious recognition transforms it from background noise into meaningful communication. When you understand that you're always in conversation with consciousness itself, every experience becomes potentially significant, every encounter a possible message, every apparent coincidence a potential confirmation of the reality you're creating through your assumptions. The practical implications of this understanding extend far beyond manifestation or personal development. They touch the very heart of what it means to be conscious in an interconnected universe. You're never truly alone because you're always in relationship with the intelligence that expresses itself through the beautiful complexity of existence. This conversation operates through multiple channels simultaneously. The external signs and synchronicities we've explored extensively, the internal promptings of intuition and emotional guidance, the responses of other people to shifts in your consciousness, the environmental changes that mirror your evolving sense of self, the dreams that rehearse possibilities, the challenges that clear space for growth. All of these are voices in a single ongoing conversation between your individual consciousness and the vast field of awareness in which that individuality exists. Learning to recognize and participate consciously in this dialogue transforms not just how you manifest your desires, but how you experience being alive. As we venture deeper into this exploration of consciousness and its mysterious communications, we find ourselves approaching questions that have puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. What is the nature of awareness itself? Is it something that emerges from complex arrangements of matter? Or might it be something more fundamental, perhaps even woven into the very fabric of reality that quantum mechanics has opened to our understanding? Recent developments in our understanding have opened fascinating new avenues for contemplating these ancient questions. While we must be careful not to make claims that go beyond what current science can support, there are intriguing parallels between how consciousness operates and some of the strange behaviours observed in quantum systems. Consider the phenomenon of quantum superposition, where particles seem to exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're observed or measured. Some interpretations suggest, though this remains speculative and unproven, that consciousness might operate according to similar principles, existing in multiple potential states until it crystallizes into specific experiences through the mysterious process we call observation. Take a moment to reflect on this possibility. Right now, as you listen, your awareness contains countless potential thoughts, feelings, and insights. In any given moment, you could focus on the sound of these words, the feeling of your breath, a memory from yesterday, or an anticipation of tomorrow. It's as if consciousness maintains a field of possibility that collapses into specific experience through the act of attention. This is purely metaphorical speaking, of course. We have no scientific evidence that consciousness literally operates according to quantum mechanical principles. But the parallels are intriguing enough that some researchers have begun exploring whether quantum effects might play a role in how awareness functions, particularly in the brain's neural networks. One of the most famous aspects of quantum mechanics is the observer effect, the idea that the very act of observation influences what is observed. While this phenomenon is well established at the quantum scale, some interpretations suggest it might have broader implications for how consciousness interacts with reality. Again, we must emphasize that this remains highly speculative and lacks scientific consensus, but consider your own experience of paying attention. When you begin to notice synchronicities in your life, do you encounter more of them? When you focus on evidence of positive change, does such evidence seem to appear more frequently? This could be explained entirely through psychological mechanisms, selective attention, confirmation bias, and the brain's pattern recognition systems. But some researchers wonder whether something more subtle might be at work, something that bridges the gap between the observer effects we see in quantum systems and the observer effects we experience in daily life. A friend of mine, a physicist turned meditation teacher, often describes awareness as nature's most sophisticated measurement device. Unlike the instruments we use in laboratories, consciousness doesn't just detect what's already there. It seems to participate in the very process of reality becoming definite and specific. This participation might operate through mechanisms we don't yet understand. While we know that consciousness can influence the body through well-documented pathways, stress affecting immune function, meditation changing brain structure, the possibility that awareness might influence reality through more subtle channels remains an open question in the borderlands between science and philosophy. As you contemplate this idea, notice how the simple act of paying attention seems to change your relationship to what you're observing. Even now, as we discuss these concepts, your focused attention might be revealing aspects of your own experience that were previously outside your awareness. Quantum entanglement represents one of the most mysterious phenomena in physics. When two particles become entangled, they remain connected in a way that transcends space and time. Measuring one particle instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein famously called this spooky action at a distance. While we must be extremely cautious about drawing direct parallels between quantum entanglement and human experience, there's no scientific evidence that our thoughts or emotions create entanglement effects. The phenomenon does raise fascinating questions about the nature of connection itself. Consider those moments when you think of someone just before they call, or when you and a close friend simultaneously have the same unusual idea. While these experiences are likely explained by psychological factors, like shared experiences and unconscious pattern recognition, they do hint at something profound about how consciousness might be more interconnected than we typically assume. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that entanglement might be a fundamental feature of reality rather than an exotic exception. If this is true, and this remains highly speculative, it raises intriguing possibilities about how individual consciousnesses might participate in larger patterns of awareness. This doesn't mean that your thoughts directly influence distant events or other people's experiences. Such claims go far beyond what current science can support. But it does suggest that the boundaries between self and other, between individual awareness and collective consciousness, might be more fluid than our everyday experience suggests. Take a gentle breath here and consider your own experiences of unexpected connection. Have there been moments when you felt unusually attuned to someone else's thoughts or feelings? While these experiences don't prove anything about quantum entanglement in human consciousness, they do point toward the mysterious ways in which awareness seems to transcend the isolation of individual minds. One of the most intriguing areas where consciousness research intersects with physics involves studies of collective attention and its potential effects on physical systems. While these investigations remain controversial and their findings are far from conclusively established, They raise fascinating questions about the relationship between awareness and the material world. Some researchers have investigated what happens when large groups of people focus their attention on similar outcomes. The findings are preliminary and hotly debated within the scientific community, but some studies have reported correlations between periods of collective meditation or focused attention and measurable changes in environmental systems. It's crucial to emphasize that correlation does not imply causation, and these findings require much more research before any definitive conclusions can be drawn. The mechanisms behind any such effects, if they exist, remain completely unknown. But the possibility that collective consciousness might influence physical systems in subtle ways continues to intrigue researchers at the edges of conventional science. Consider the experience of being in a room where everyone is focused on the same thing. A concert, a religious service, a moment of shared silence. There's often a palpable sense of coherence, as if individual consciousnesses are temporarily synchronizing into something larger than the sum of their parts. While this synchronization might operate entirely through known psychological and social mechanisms, some researchers wonder whether quantum coherence effects might also play a role. In quantum systems, coherence occurs when particles coordinate their behavior in ways that amplify certain possibilities while cancelling out others. This is highly speculative and remains unproven, but imagine if consciousness could achieve similar states of coherence. Groups of people focusing on similar intentions might, in theory, create collective patterns of awareness that influence reality in ways we don't yet understand. As you reflect on this possibility, think about times when you felt part of a group consciousness, moments when individual awareness seemed to dissolve into something shared and collective. These experiences, whether or not they involve any quantum mechanical effects, point toward the profound interconnectedness that seems to characterize consciousness at its deepest levels. In quantum field theory, what we think of as empty space is actually seething with potential. Virtual particles constantly appearing and disappearing, fields of possibility that give rise to everything we observe in the material world. Some interpretations suggest that consciousness might operate according to similar principles, existing as a field of pure potential that crystallizes into specific experiences through unknown mechanisms. This is purely speculative thinking, far beyond what current science can demonstrate. But consider your own experience of creativity and inspiration. Ideas seem to emerge from nowhere, suddenly appearing in consciousness as if they were always there, waiting to be discovered. Where do these insights come from? How does awareness generate novelty from apparent emptiness? The quantum field perspective offers a metaphorical framework for understanding how consciousness might participate in the ongoing creation of reality. Just as quantum fields give rise to particles and forces through processes we're still working to understand, consciousness might give rise to thoughts, experiences, and perhaps even external events through mechanisms that remain largely mysterious. This doesn't mean that individual minds directly manipulate quantum fields. Such claims lack scientific support and venture into the realm of unfounded speculation. Rather, it suggests that consciousness itself might be more fundamental than we typically assume, perhaps operating according to principles that bridge the quantum and classical worlds. I'm reminded of a meditation teacher who described awareness as the space in which all experience appears. From this perspective, consciousness isn't produced by the brain, but rather exists as a fundamental field in which thoughts, sensations, and perceptions arise and dissolve like waves in an ocean. While this view remains philosophical rather than scientific, it aligns intriguingly with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics that suggest information and consciousness might be more fundamental than matter and energy. These ideas remain highly controversial and lack scientific consensus, but they open fascinating avenues for contemplating the nature of awareness itself. As you sit with these concepts, notice the space of awareness in which these thoughts and ideas are appearing. What is the nature of this space? Is it produced by neural activity, or might it be something more fundamental, a field of pure possibility in which all experience unfolds? Heisenberg's uncertainty principle tells us that we cannot simultaneously know both the position and momentum of a particle with perfect precision. The more accurately we measure one property, the less accurately we can know the other. This isn't a limitation of our measuring instruments. It appears to be a fundamental feature of reality itself. Some interpretations suggest that consciousness might operate according to similar principles of uncertainty, though we must emphasize that this remains speculative and unproven. Consider your own inner experience. The more closely you examine a particular thought or emotion, the more it seems to change in response to your observation. The act of introspection itself influences what you find. This isn't necessarily a quantum mechanical effect in consciousness. It could be explained entirely through known psychological processes. But the parallel is intriguing. Just as quantum systems exist in superposition until observed, your inner life might exist in a state of fluid potential until the moment you turn your attention towards specific aspects of experience. Think about trying to capture a subtle mood or fleeting insight. The harder you grasp for it, the more elusive it becomes. But when you observe with gentle attention, allowing experiences to reveal themselves without force, your inner life often displays a richness and complexity that disappears under intense scrutiny. This principle might extend to how consciousness interacts with external reality as well. The desperate seeking for signs and synchronicities that we discussed earlier might interfere with their natural appearance, while relaxed awareness allows meaningful patterns to reveal themselves organically. A physicist friend once told me that quantum mechanics taught her to hold scientific theories lightly, not as fixed truths, but as useful maps for navigating mystery. Perhaps consciousness requires a similar lightness of touch, a willingness to engage with its mysteries without demanding that it conform to our conceptual frameworks. Take a moment to experiment with this uncertainty principle in your own awareness. Instead of trying to pin down exactly what you're thinking or feeling right now, can you rest in the space of not knowing, allowing your inner experience to remain fluid and undefined? In quantum mechanics, the measurement problem asks a deceptively simple question. What exactly constitutes a measurement? When does a quantum system stop existing in superposition and collapse into a definite state? Despite decades of research, this remains one of the most perplexing questions in physics. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness itself might play a role in collapsing quantum possibilities into definite realities, though this remains highly controversial and lacks scientific consensus. While we cannot make any definitive claims about consciousness causing quantum effects, the parallels between quantum measurement and conscious observation continue to fascinate researchers and philosophers. Consider your own experience of decision-making. Before you choose, multiple possibilities exist in a state that feels remarkably similar to quantum superposition. You could call a friend or stay home, read a book or watch a movie, have coffee or tea. All these possibilities coexist in awareness until the moment of decision collapses them into a single, definite action. This collapse from possibility to actuality happens countless times throughout your day, usually without conscious recognition. But occasionally, you might notice the strange moment of transition, the instant when potential becomes real, when the many becomes one. While this process might operate entirely through known neurological mechanisms, some researchers wonder whether consciousness employs principles similar to those we observe in quantum systems. The brain, after all, is a complex network of interconnected particles, and some of its functions might depend on quantum mechanical processes we don't yet understand. This is speculative territory, far from proven science, but it opens intriguing questions about the relationship between mind and matter, between subjective experience and objective reality. If consciousness does participate in collapsing possibilities into experience, it suggests that awareness is not a passive observer of reality, but an active participant in its ongoing creation. As you contemplate this idea, notice the constant process of selection happening in your consciousness right now. Out of infinite possible thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, your awareness is continuously choosing which ones to attend to, which ones to develop, which ones to let fade into the background. The double slit experiment stands as one of the most elegant and mysterious demonstrations in all of physics. When particles are fired at a screen with two slits, they create an interference pattern suggesting they pass through both slits simultaneously, until we try to observe which slit they actually used, at which point they behave like ordinary particles, following definite paths. While we must be extremely careful not to make unfounded claims about consciousness creating quantum effects, some researchers have wondered whether attention might operate according to similar principles. When you're not paying attention to something specific, your awareness seems to exist in a state of open possibility, potentially responsive to multiple streams of information simultaneously. But the moment you focus attention on a particular object or experience, that broad field of awareness collapses into a narrow beam of concentration. It's as if consciousness exhibits both wave-like and particle-like properties, depending on how it's observed and directed. This is purely metaphorical thinking, not a scientific claim about consciousness literally exhibiting quantum behavior. But the parallel offers an intriguing way to think about how attention functions in daily life. When you're walking through a familiar environment, your awareness might be processing countless subtle cues simultaneously: sounds, movements, changes in light and shadow. Most of this processing happens below the threshold of conscious recognition, creating a kind of interference pattern of possibility in your field of awareness. But when something captures your attention, an unexpected sound, an unusual sight, consciousness suddenly becomes focused and definite, collapsing from broad possibility into specific recognition. I remember a meditation retreat where the teacher asked us to experiment with this dual nature of attention. Can you be aware of being aware, she asked, without focusing on any particular object of awareness? It was a fascinating exploration of consciousness in its wave-like state, open and undetermined, responsive to everything and focused on nothing. Try this experiment for yourself. Can you allow your attention to exist in a state of open possibility, neither grasping for specific experiences nor pushing anything away? Notice how different this feels from the more familiar focused attention you use when reading, working, or engaging in conversation. Recent developments in theoretical physics have suggested that information might be stored on the boundaries of regions rather than throughout their volume, a principle known as holography. Some researchers have wondered whether consciousness and memory might operate according to similar holographic principles, though this remains highly speculative and unproven. Consider how memory seems to work in your own experience. A single trigger, a scent, a piece of music, a particular quality of light can instantly reconstruct an entire complex experience from years ago, complete with sensory details, emotions, and contextual information. It's as if the whole of the memory is somehow encoded in each of its parts. This holographic quality of memory might extend to consciousness itself. Every moment of awareness seems to contain traces of past experiences, hints of future possibilities, and connections to the broader field of knowledge and understanding you've accumulated throughout your life. Consciousness doesn't seem to store information in discrete locations, but rather as patterns distributed throughout the entire field of awareness. While this might operate entirely through known neurological processes, some interpretations suggest that consciousness might employ holographic principles we don't yet understand. If information is indeed stored holographically in the brain, it could help explain the remarkable capacity of awareness to reconstruct complex experiences from minimal cues. This holographic perspective also offers an intriguing way to think about how individual consciousness might relate to collective awareness. Just as each part of a hologram contains information about the whole image, individual minds might contain traces of the larger patterns of consciousness in which they are embedded. This is speculative thinking, far from proven science, but it resonates with the deep sense of interconnection that many people report during profound states of awareness. It's as if individual consciousness is simultaneously distinct and inseparable from the larger field of awareness in which it exists. As you reflect on this possibility, consider your own relationship to memory and knowledge. How do you access information and experiences that seemed completely forgotten until the right trigger brought them back to awareness? What does this suggest about the nature of consciousness and its capacity to store and retrieve the patterns of experience? In physics, emergence describes how complex systems can display properties and behaviors that are not present in their individual components. Consciousness itself might be an emergent property of neural networks, though how subjective experience arises from objective brain activity remains one of the deepest mysteries in science. But consciousness doesn't just emerge, it seems to create emergence, generating meaning and significance from the raw data of sensory experience. The photons hitting your retina become a sunset. The vibrations in the air become music. The electrochemical signals in your nervous system become the rich, subjective experience of being alive. This meaning-making capacity of consciousness appears to operate through principles we don't fully understand. While we can map many of the neural correlates of experience, the actual mechanism by which objective brain activity becomes subjective awareness remains largely mysterious. Some researchers wonder whether quantum mechanical processes might play a role in this emergence of consciousness, particularly in the brain's microtubules, tiny structures within neurons that maintain the cell's shape and facilitate transport. While these ideas remain highly speculative and lack scientific consensus, they suggest that consciousness might bridge quantum and classical realms in ways we're only beginning to explore. The emergence of meaning from meaningless components parallels what we observe in quantum systems, where definite properties emerge from indefinite possibilities through processes we're still working to understand. While we cannot claim that consciousness literally operates according to quantum mechanical principles, the parallels offer intriguing avenues for contemplating the mystery of awareness itself. Consider your own experience of meaning-making. Right now, as you listen to these words, consciousness is transforming abstract concepts into understanding, converting sound waves into significance. How does this transformation happen? What is the nature of the process by which awareness creates meaning from the raw material of experience? This capacity to generate meaning seems to be fundamental to consciousness itself. Even in dreams, when external sensory input is minimal, awareness continues to weave experiences into narratives, creating significance from the spontaneous activity of the sleeping brain. The quantum Zeno effect describes a fascinating phenomenon in which frequent observation of a quantum system can actually prevent it from evolving. By measuring a system repeatedly, observers can effectively freeze its development, keeping it in its initial state indefinitely. Some interpretations suggest that meditation might operate according to similar principles, though this remains speculative and unproven. When you observe thoughts and emotions with sustained attention, neither grasping nor pushing away, but simply witnessing, they often seem to lose their compulsive power and fade naturally. This isn't necessarily a quantum mechanical effect in consciousness. It could be explained entirely through known psychological processes like habituation and cognitive diffusion. But the parallel is intriguing, particularly for understanding how contemplative practices might work. In traditional meditation, you learn to observe the contents of consciousness without getting caught up in them. Thoughts arise, are witnessed, and dissolve. Emotions emerge, are acknowledged, and pass away. Through sustained observation, the usually compelling nature of mental activity begins to lose its grip on attention. It's as if the act of conscious observation changes the behavior of the observed mental phenomena, preventing them from developing into the complex patterns of rumination, anxiety, or emotional reactivity that usually characterize unconscious mental activity. A meditation teacher once described this process as learning to be a scientist of your own consciousness. Instead of being caught up in the drama of thoughts and emotions, you step back and observe their arising and passing with the same neutral curiosity a physicist might bring to studying particle interactions. This shift from participation to observation seems to fundamentally alter the nature of mental experience. While this might operate entirely through known neurological mechanisms, some researchers wonder whether quantum mechanical principles might also play a role in how conscious observation affects the systems it observes. Try this for yourself. Can you observe your thoughts and emotions as if they were natural phenomena, interesting patterns arising and dissolving in the space of awareness? Notice how this quality of observation affects your relationship to the contents of consciousness. Recent theories in consciousness research suggest that awareness might arise from the integration of information across different regions of the brain. According to integrated information theory, consciousness corresponds to how much information a system integrates, the degree to which the parts of a system share information with each other in ways that generate unified experience. This perspective aligns intriguingly with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics that emphasize information as fundamental to reality. Some physicists now suggest that information, rather than matter or energy, might be the basic building block of the universe, an idea that could have profound implications for understanding consciousness. While these theories remain highly speculative and far from proven, they offer fascinating ways to think about how individual experiences of consciousness might relate to larger patterns of information integration. If consciousness emerges from information integration, then individual awareness might be part of larger networks of integrated information that extend beyond the boundaries of individual brains. This doesn't mean that consciousness literally creates quantum entanglement or directly manipulates information fields. Such claims lack scientific support. But it does suggest that awareness might participate in information networks we don't yet understand. Networks that could help explain the synchronicities and meaningful connections we explored earlier. Consider your own experience of understanding. Right now, as these concepts integrate with your existing knowledge and experience, consciousness is performing an extraordinary feat of information synthesis. Ideas that seem separate are connecting, patterns are emerging, new possibilities for understanding are arising. This integration happens not just within individual consciousness, but between minds as well. Through language, art, and shared experience, individual patterns of understanding connect with collective patterns of knowledge, creating networks of integrated information that span cultures and generations. While the mechanisms behind this integration remain largely mysterious, the experience itself points towards something profound about the nature of consciousness, its inherent capacity to connect, synthesize, and create meaning from the vast flow of information that constitutes experience. As you sit with these ideas, notice how your consciousness is integrating them with your own understanding and experience. What new connections are emerging? What possibilities for understanding are arising from this process of information integration? In quantum mechanics, decoherence explains how quantum systems lose their strange properties when they interact with their environment. The delicate superpositions and entanglements that characterize quantum behavior quickly dissolve when particles encounter the noise and chaos of the macroscopic world. Some interpretations suggest that consciousness might face similar challenges in maintaining coherent states of awareness. The busy, distracted nature of modern life might cause the subtle quantum-like properties of consciousness to decohere, reducing awareness to more classical mechanical patterns of thought and behavior. This is purely speculative thinking, not a proven scientific principle, but it offers an intriguing framework for understanding why contemplative practices across cultures emphasize the importance of stillness, silence, and reduced sensory input. Perhaps these conditions allow consciousness to maintain more coherent, integrated states that are disrupted by the constant stimulation of ordinary life. Consider your own experience of different states of awareness. In moments of deep calm or focused attention, consciousness often feels more unified and coherent. But in busy, stressful situations, awareness can become fragmented and scattered, pulled in multiple directions by competing demands for attention. While this fragmentation might operate entirely through known psychological mechanisms, some researchers wonder whether quantum coherence effects in the brain might also play a role. If consciousness does depend on quantum mechanical processes, then environmental factors that cause decoherence could significantly affect the quality and integration of awareness. This perspective suggests that practices like meditation, spending time in nature, or engaging in focused creative work might help consciousness maintain more coherent states by reducing the environmental noise that causes decoherence. While this remains unproven, it aligns with the widespread recognition that such practices enhance mental clarity and emotional stability. A neuroscientist friend once told me that the brain is essentially a quantum system trying to maintain coherence in a noisy classical environment. While this was more poetic than scientific, it captures something important about the challenges consciousness faces in maintaining its subtle properties amid the chaos of modern life. Take a moment to reflect on the different states of consciousness you experience throughout your day. When does awareness feel most coherent and integrated? What conditions seem to support or undermine the subtle qualities of consciousness that we've been exploring? One of the most mysterious aspects of quantum mechanics is non-locality, the idea that particles can be connected across space in ways that seem to transcend the normal limitations of distance and time. While we must be extremely careful not to claim that consciousness exhibits literal quantum non-locality, there are intriguing parallels in how insight and understanding seem to arise. Consider those moments when solutions to complex problems suddenly appear in consciousness, often when you're not actively thinking about them. The insight seems to come from nowhere, arriving fully formed like a gift from some unknown source. Where do these breakthrough moments originate? How does consciousness access understanding that wasn't there moments before? This non-local quality of insight might operate entirely through known psychological processes, the unconscious mind working on problems below the threshold of awareness, pattern recognition systems making connections between seemingly unrelated information. But some researchers wonder whether consciousness might access information through channels we don't yet understand. While this remains highly speculative and unproven, the phenomenology of insight does share certain characteristics with quantum non-locality. Information seems to appear instantaneously without traveling through normal causal channels. Understanding emerges that feels both completely new and strangely familiar, as if it were always there waiting to be discovered. I remember a mathematician describing how she solved a problem that had puzzled her for months. The solution came while she was washing dishes, arriving as a complete understanding rather than a step-by-step logical progression. It was as if the answer existed somewhere else, she said, and I just needed to tune into the right frequency to receive it. This metaphor of consciousness as a receiver rather than a generator of information offers an intriguing way to think about the non-local aspects of awareness. Instead of creating insights from nothing, consciousness might be accessing patterns of understanding that exist in some larger field of information, a field that transcends the boundaries of individual minds. While this remains purely speculative, it resonates with reports from many creative individuals who describe their best work as coming through them rather than from them. Writers speak of stories that write themselves. Musicians describe melodies that seem to play themselves. Scientists report discoveries that feel more like remembering than inventing. This non-local quality of insight might help explain the synchronicities and meaningful connections we explored earlier. If consciousness can access information through non-local channels, then the appearance of exactly the right book, person, or opportunity at precisely the right moment becomes less mysterious. It's as if awareness naturally aligns with the patterns of information that support its evolution and understanding. As you reflect on your own experiences of insight and understanding, notice whether they feel like personal creations or discoveries of something that already existed. This subtle distinction might reveal important clues about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the larger field of information in which it operates. In quantum mechanics, complementarity describes how particles can exhibit seemingly contradictory properties, behaving as both waves and particles depending on how they're observed. This isn't a limitation of our understanding, but appears to be a fundamental feature of reality itself. Some interpretations suggest that consciousness might exhibit similar complementarity, existing simultaneously as subjective experience and objective brain activity. This remains highly speculative and lacks scientific consensus, but it offers an intriguing framework for thinking about the mind-body relationship that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. From one perspective, consciousness appears to be entirely produced by neural activity. Brain scans show clear correlations between subjective states and objective brain patterns. Damage to specific brain regions affects consciousness in predictable ways. The materialist view suggests that awareness is nothing more than complex information processing in biological networks. But from another perspective, consciousness exhibits properties that seem irreducible to mere computation. The qualitative, subjective nature of experience, what philosophers call qualia, remains mysterious even when we can map its neural correlates perfectly. The unified nature of awareness, the sense of being a single, conscious entity despite the brain's distributed processing, challenges purely materialist explanations. Perhaps like quantum particles, consciousness doesn't have a single, definitive nature. Maybe it's both subjective experience and objective brain activity, both individual awareness and universal information processing, both emergent property and fundamental feature of reality. This complementarity perspective suggests that the question, what is consciousness, might be like asking, what is light, wave or particle? The answer depends on how you look, what questions you ask, what kind of measurement you make. A philosopher friend once told me that consciousness might be the universe's way of experiencing itself subjectively, while physics describes the same reality from an objective perspective. Both views might be equally valid, equally incomplete, complementary aspects of a truth, too large for any single perspective to contain. As you contemplate this possibility, notice how your own consciousness seems to exhibit this complementarity. You can study your thoughts and feelings as if they were objective phenomena, but you can also simply be them, experiencing them from within as the very fabric of your subjective reality. One of the fundamental challenges in consciousness research is that subjective experience seems to resist the objective measurement that science requires. How do you quantify the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, or the joy of joy? These qualitative aspects of consciousness appear to exist in a realm beyond numbers and equations. Yet quantum mechanics faces similar challenges. Many quantum properties cannot be measured directly, but must be inferred from their effects on systems we can observe. The quantum state itself remains hidden behind the veil of measurement, revealing only statistical patterns that hint at deeper realities. This parallel suggests that consciousness research might need to develop new methodologies that go beyond traditional scientific measurement. While we cannot abandon empirical rigor, we might need to supplement objective methods with intersubjective approaches that honor the inherently experiential nature of awareness. Some researchers are already exploring such approaches, using contemplative traditions as laboratories for consciousness research. Experienced meditators can report on subtle states of awareness with remarkable consistency and precision, offering a kind of first-person data that complements third-person neurological measurements. This integration of subjective and objective methodologies doesn't abandon scientific rigor, but expands it to include dimensions of reality that purely objective approaches cannot access. It's similar to how quantum mechanics required new mathematical frameworks that could handle superposition, uncertainty, and non-locality. Consider your own capacity for inner observation. Right now, you can notice the quality of your attention, the texture of your thoughts, the felt sense of understanding as these concepts integrate with your existing knowledge. This introspective capacity represents a sophisticated form of measurement that science is only beginning to appreciate and utilize. The development of consciousness research might require what we could call a contemplative science, an approach that maintains empirical rigor while acknowledging that consciousness contains dimensions that can only be explored from within. This doesn't mean abandoning objectivity, but expanding our definition of valid ways of knowing. As you sit with these ideas, notice the remarkable capacity of consciousness to observe itself, to study its own patterns and processes with a precision that rivals any scientific instrument. This self-reflective awareness might be the key to unlocking the deepest mysteries of consciousness and its relationship to the quantum realm. If consciousness does participate in reality's unfolding through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand, this raises profound questions about the ethical dimensions of awareness itself. While we must be careful not to make unfounded claims about consciousness directly causing external events, the possibility that awareness influences reality carries significant moral implications. This speculative idea that consciousness might participate in shaping reality through subtle quantum mechanical effects suggests that the quality of our awareness matters not just for our own well-being, but potentially for the larger systems in which we're embedded. If this is true, then developing more coherent, compassionate, and wise states of consciousness becomes not just a personal practice, but a form of service to the world. While this remains entirely theoretical and unproven, it aligns with wisdom traditions that have long emphasized the interconnected nature of consciousness and reality. Many contemplative practices are based on the understanding that inner transformation naturally leads to beneficial changes in one's relationship with the world. Consider the ripple effects of conscious awareness in your own life. When you approach situations with calm clarity rather than reactive anxiety, the outcomes often differ significantly. When you listen with genuine presence rather than distracted attention, relationships deepen and flourish. While these effects operate through entirely conventional channels, they demonstrate how the quality of consciousness influences the quality of experience. If quantum mechanical effects do play a role in consciousness, and this remains highly speculative, then practices that enhance coherence, integration, and clarity of awareness might have implications that extend beyond individual benefit. The cultivation of wisdom, compassion, and understanding becomes not just personal development, but participation in the larger evolution of consciousness itself. This perspective doesn't require belief in supernatural abilities or direct mental influence over physical events. Rather, it suggests that consciousness naturally seeks expression through actions, relationships, and choices that align with its highest capacities. The more fully we develop these capacities, the more beneficial our participation in the world becomes. As you reflect on this possibility, consider how the quality of your own consciousness affects not just your inner experience, but your interactions with others and your participation in larger systems. How might developing greater clarity, compassion, and wisdom serve not just your own evolution, but the evolution of consciousness itself? As we stand at the intersection of quantum physics and consciousness research, we find ourselves at the threshold of potentially revolutionary discoveries about the nature of mind and reality. While current theories remain speculative and unproven, they point toward research directions that could fundamentally transform our understanding of what it means to be conscious. The development of quantum computers might provide new tools for exploring whether quantum mechanical effects play a role in biological consciousness. If the brain does employ quantum computation in ways we don't yet understand, quantum technologies might help us detect and study these processes with unprecedented precision. Similarly, advances in neurotechnology are giving researchers increasingly sophisticated tools for observing the brain in action. As our ability to measure neural activity improves, we might discover quantum mechanical processes operating in biological systems, processes that could bridge the gap between objective brain activity and subjective experience. But perhaps the most important developments will come from integrating objective scientific methods with subjective contemplative approaches. The marriage of ancient wisdom traditions with modern scientific rigor might yield insights that neither approach could achieve alone. This integration requires scientists who are also skilled contemplatives, and contemplatives who understand rigorous scientific methodology. Such individuals can serve as bridges between different ways of knowing, translating insights from contemplative practice into testable hypotheses and scientific discoveries into deeper understanding of consciousness. The implications of this research extend far beyond academic curiosity. If consciousness does participate in realities unfolding through quantum mechanical or other subtle processes, this could transform our approach to education, healthcare, social organization, and environmental stewardship. Understanding consciousness might be the key to addressing many of the challenges facing human civilization. Consider your own role in this emerging understanding. Every moment of conscious awareness represents a data point in the vast experiment of consciousness exploring itself. Your attention, your insights, your moments of clarity and confusion all contribute to the larger pattern through which awareness comes to understand its own nature. This isn't metaphorical, but literal. Consciousness research depends on conscious beings willing to explore the depths of their own awareness with both scientific rigor and contemplative depth. You are both the scientist and the laboratory in this grand investigation of mind and reality. This sense of wonder is itself significant. Wonder represents consciousness encountering the limits of its current understanding and responding not with frustration, but with curiosity and awe. It's the emotional signature of mind's touching mystery, of awareness recognizing its participation in something far larger than any individual understanding can contain. The quantum realm teaches us that reality is far stranger and more beautiful than our everyday experience suggests. Particles that exist in multiple states simultaneously, connections that transcend space and time, information that seems more fundamental than matter itself. These discoveries invite us to approach existence with fresh eyes, free from the assumptions that limit our perception of what's possible. Similarly, consciousness research is revealing awareness to be far more mysterious and powerful than we typically recognize. The capacity to observe itself, to create meaning from meaningless information, to generate experiences of beauty, love, and understanding from electrochemical processes. These abilities point towards something profound about the nature of mind and its place in the cosmic order. The synthesis of these insights doesn't provide easy answers or simple solutions to the challenges of existence. Instead, It offers something more valuable, a renewed sense of participation in the ongoing mystery of reality itself. We are not separate observers of a mechanical universe, but conscious participants in a reality that is still creating itself, still discovering its own nature through the very awareness that seeks to understand it. This participation requires humility about what we know, combined with courage to explore what we don't yet understand. It asks us to hold scientific rigor and contemplative insight in creative tension, neither abandoning empirical precision nor dismissing the insights that emerge from careful introspection. As you continue your own exploration of consciousness and its mysteries, remember that you carry within yourself the same awareness that gives rise to quantum mechanics, the same consciousness that wonders about its own nature. You are not solving a problem external to yourself, but participating in consciousness, coming to understand itself more fully. Tonight, we've journeyed through territories where science and contemplation converge, where the objective methods of physics meet the subjective depths of consciousness. We've explored speculative possibilities and acknowledged the vast unknowns that still surround the deepest questions about mind and reality. What emerges from this exploration is not a final theory or definitive explanation, but rather a profound appreciation for the mystery in which we find ourselves embedded. Consciousness remains the most intimate, yet most enigmatic aspect of existence, the very awareness through which all knowledge arises, yet something that knowledge cannot fully capture or explain. The quantum mechanical analogies we've explored, superposition, entanglement, complementarity, non-locality, offer metaphorical frameworks for thinking about consciousness, but they don't provide mechanical explanations for the mystery of awareness itself. Instead, they invite us to approach consciousness with the same sense of wonder and intellectual humility that quantum mechanics requires. This humility is not a limitation, but a doorway. When we recognize the limits of current understanding, we create space for new insights to emerge. When we acknowledge that consciousness might operate according to principles we don't yet comprehend, we open ourselves to possibilities that rigid conceptual frameworks might exclude. The practical implications of this exploration extend into every moment of daily life. If consciousness does participate in reality's unfolding through subtle mechanisms we're still discovering, then every moment of awareness becomes significant. The quality of attention you bring to this moment, the depth of presence you cultivate in your relationships, the clarity and compassion you develop through contemplative practice, all of these might contribute to the larger evolution of consciousness itself. This doesn't require believing in supernatural abilities or abandoning scientific rationality. Rather, it suggests that consciousness naturally seeks expression through wisdom, compassion, and understanding. Tonight, as we've explored the hidden language through which consciousness communicates, we've discovered something profound about the nature of reality itself. The signs aren't random coincidences or wishful thinking. They're evidence of a conversation that's been happening all along between your deepest assumptions about yourself and the infinite field of possibility that surrounds you. From Neville's bridge of incidents to the quantum-like properties of awareness, from the synchronicities that appear when assumptions take root to the dreams that rehearse future realities, we've seen that you're not a passive observer of a predetermined world. You're an active participant in reality's ongoing creation through the mysterious power of consciousness itself. The universe speaks to you through numbers that catch your attention at precisely the right moments, through obstacles that clear space for better opportunities, through the sudden appearance of your desires everywhere you look. These aren't supernatural phenomena, but natural expressions of how consciousness operates when it aligns with truth rather than limitation. Remember this: the conversation never stops. Every moment offers fresh communication from the deeper intelligence that orchestrates your experience. The signs are always there, gentle and persistent, waiting for you to develop the sensitivity to perceive them. Your role isn't to force or manipulate this process, but to trust it, recognize it, and allow it to unfold with the elegant timing that consciousness knows best. As you move forward from tonight's exploration, carry with you the understanding that you're never alone, never without guidance, never truly lost. You're always in dialogue with a universe that responds to the deepest truths you hold about yourself. The eternal conversation continues, and your awareness is both the question and the answer in this magnificent mystery of existence. Sleep well, knowing that even in rest, consciousness continues weaving tomorrow's synchronicities and preparing the bridge of incidents that carries you ever closer to the fullest expression of who you truly are. Carries you ever closer to the fullest expression of who you truly are.